The story begins on a cold November morning in the year 1864. The sky above the Colorado plains is still dark, and the first hints of sunrise are only a soft red glow on the horizon. The land is quiet, except for the faint rustle of dry grass and the distant sound of horses breathing in the cold air. In this silence, hundreds of soldiers sit on horseback, waiting for a command that will change history forever. Among these soldiers sits a young officer named Captain Silas Soule. He is only 26 years old, but his face carries the calm strength of a man who has lived through danger and hardship. Silas watches the horizon as light slowly returns to the world, but there is no peace in his heart this morning. Something feels wrong, very wrong. The soldiers around him tighten their grips on their rifles. They whisper to each other, nervous and excited, believing that today will bring them glory. Behind them rides their commander, Colonel John Milton Chivington, a tall, powerful man with a sharp gaze and a booming voice. Chivington is known across the territory as the fighting parson, a preacher-turned-soldier who once inspired men with sermons and now commands them with fierce ambition. But Silas Soule does not feel inspired by him today. Instead, he feels a heavy weight forming in his chest. The order that is about to be given does not feel like justice, and it does not feel like war. It feels like something else entirely. Ahead of the soldiers lies a quiet village along the sandy banks of a small creek. The village belongs to a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho, families who believed they were under the protection of the U.S. government. They had raised the American flag above their camp as a sign of peace. Men, women, children, and elders are all asleep, unaware that hundreds of armed soldiers are approaching them in the dim light of dawn. Colonel Chivington rides forward and raises his hand. The soldiers straighten their backs. The moment has come. Silas waits. His heart beats slowly, steadily, but every beat feels like a drum against his ribs. Chivington gives the order. A single word, a word that splits the morning in two. Charge. The soldiers shout and rush forward. Hooves thunder across the ground. Guns lift. Rifles point. A storm of violence is about to fall upon sleeping families. But in the middle of this rising chaos, one company of soldiers does not move. Silas Soule sits still on his horse. His men look at him, confused, waiting for his signal. He does not raise his weapon. He does not push his horse forward. He simply watches the peaceful camp ahead, and he feels his soul recoil. He knows what he is being asked to do. He knows who is in that camp, and he knows the truth. These are not enemies. These are unarmed families who were promised safety. Silas takes a breath, and his voice breaks the tension around him. Hold your fire, he shouts. We will not attack. The soldiers beside him freeze. Some stare at him with shock. Some look away, unsure. Others mutter nervously, fearing that disobeying orders might cost them everything. But Silas does not back down. His voice rises again steady, strong, impossible to ignore. This is not right, he says. We will not join this. For a brief moment, time seems to stop. Around him, the roar of charging horses continues. Gunshots explode in the distance. Screams rise from the village. Smoke begins to drift through the cold morning air. But Silas and his men remain firm. They do not move. They do not fire a single shot. And in that moment, Silas Soule becomes something the frontier almost never saw: a soldier who chooses conscience over command. This is where his story truly begins. Silas Soule was not a reckless man. He was not a man who defied orders lightly. His courage did not come from pride or stubbornness. It came from his life, from his beliefs, and from the values that shaped him from childhood. He had grown up in a family that fought against slavery. His home was part of the Underground Railroad, a secret network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. As a teenager, he had risked his own life to save a man who was being returned to slavery. Even then, he understood that doing what was right often meant standing alone. And now, on this dark November morning, he found himself alone once again. Behind him, some officers glare with anger. One rides close and shouts, "You are disobeying direct orders, Captain." Another threatens him, warning that this will destroy his career. But Silas does not move. His men wait silently behind him. If he gives the order to fight, they will. If he tells them to hold, they will hold. Their trust in him is deep. And on this morning, that trust saves lives. Silas keeps his eyes on the village. He sees flashes of fire. He hears cries that tear at his heart. He sees families running, desperate to escape. He wants to ride forward and protect them, but he knows that any sudden move could put his own men in danger. So instead, he stays where he is, refusing to take part in the violence. The sun finally rises. The light spreads across the plains, revealing the terrible reality of what is unfolding. But Silas Soule stays true to his choice. His company fires not a single shot. Later, many will call him a hero. But in this moment, Silas does not think of heroism. He thinks only of doing what is right, no matter the cost. And deep inside, he knows there will be a cost. Because when a man stands against cruelty, cruelty will often come for him. This morning at Sand Creek is the moment that begins the greatest test of Silas Soule's life. It is the moment that will define his legacy, and it is the moment that will put him on a path toward courage, danger, and sacrifice, a path that will soon lead him into the shadows of betrayal and revenge. But for now, on this cold morning, Silas Soule makes a choice that separates him from every other man on that field, a choice that echoes through history. He refuses to kill. Silas was born in 1838 into a family that believed deeply in doing what was right when the law said otherwise. His parents, Amessa and Sophia Soule, were not wealthy, powerful, or famous, but they were brave. Their home in Massachusetts, and later in Kansas, became a safe place for people escaping slavery. Their doors opened in the middle of the night, quietly, secretly, to welcome frightened men and women searching for freedom. Young Silas watched these moments with wide, serious eyes. He saw strangers arrive, shaking with fear, hungry and exhausted, but he also saw hope grow in them as they realized they were finally safe. His parents taught him that helping others was not just kindness, it was duty, and that duty often came with great risk. The Soule family lived under the shadow of danger every day. Helping enslaved people escape was illegal. Anyone caught could be arrested, fined, or even killed by slave catchers. Yet the family continued, knowing that every person they helped was one more life lifted out of suffering. And as Silas grew older, he became more involved. He helped pass messages. He watched the roads. He learned when to stay silent, and he learned when to act. One event, in particular, shaped him forever. It happened when Silas was just 17 years old. News spread that a man named Charles Willis, an escaped slave, had been captured and was being taken back into bondage. Willis had been caught by federal officers, and a large group of people gathered to watch the authorities transport him. Many were quiet. Some were angry, but most felt helpless. Silas was not helpless. He joined a group of abolitionists, including members of his own family. They planned an escape bold, dangerous, and desperate. They would free Willis from the officers and send him north to safety. It was a plan that could get them arrested or worse. When the day came, the group waited quietly as Willis was taken through the town. Silas watched the fearful look in Willis's eyes. He knew that if they failed, Willis would be dragged back into the brutal world he had fought so hard to escape. Then, suddenly, chaos erupted. The abolitionists rushed forward, shouting and pushing. Federal officers tried to fight them off. People screamed, horses reared, and in the middle of the confusion, young Silas slipped through the crowd and reached Willis. In just seconds, he helped pull him away from his captors. The group fled down a side street, with voices shouting behind them. Silas's heart pounded, but he did not look back. He didn't dare. They ran until their legs burned, and only when they reached a safe house did they finally stop. Willis was free. Silas Soule had helped free him. The rescue became famous among abolitionists. Newspapers wrote about it. Some called Silas a hero. But for Silas, it was simple. He had done what needed to be done. He had acted because no one else was brave enough in that moment. This rescue taught Silas something he would never forget. A person can always choose courage, even when surrounded by fear. Not long after, Silas and his family moved west to Kansas, where new battles were beginning. Kansas territory was torn between free state settlers and pro-slavery forces. It was a place where gunfire, burned homes, and ambushes were common. People lived with danger like it was part of the weather. Silas grew into adulthood surrounded by fighting. He saw friends threatened. He saw communities attacked. He saw how hatred could twist ordinary people into violent mobs. But he also saw resistance. He saw those who stood up, even when outnumbered. And every conflict shaped him a little more. He learned to ride fast, shoot straight, and move quietly. But above all, he learned to stay calm when others panicked. He learned that bravery wasn't loud or angry. It was steady. It was quiet. It was the moment a person refused to step back, when stepping forward was the only right choice. Years later, when Silas joined the Colorado Volunteers during the Civil War, he carried all these lessons with him. Other soldiers noticed his calm nature. He was young, but he acted older. He commanded respect, not through fear, but through integrity. Men trusted him. They knew he would not ask them to do something he would not do himself. That trust, built over years of hardship and principle, would matter greatly one day on a cold November morning at Sand Creek. It was that same steady courage from his youth that allowed him to say, no, and everyone around him obeyed the order to charge. But before that morning, before the horse hooves and gunfire, there was another moment that helped shape the man Silas would become. When he was a teenager, his father once told him something that stayed with him throughout his life. A Massacre Soule said, "Son, the law can be wrong. Leaders can be wrong. Crowds can be wrong. But your conscience, will speak to you in a way no one else can. Learn to listen to it." Silas did listen. He listened at 17 when he helped save Willis. He listened in Kansas when violence tried to silence truth. And he listened again years later, when a massacre was about to unfold under his own command. By the time Silas Soule reached adulthood, he was not just a soldier. He was a man shaped by rebellion against injustice, against cruelty, against fear, and that rebellion, born in his youth, would one day become the force that stopped him from raising his rifle at Sand Creek and pushed him toward a destiny written in courage and sacrifice. Before he became one of the most controversial figures in Western history, John Milton Chivington was known by another name, a name that carried respect, authority, and even admiration. People once called him the Fighting Parson. His story began far from the Colorado plains, long before he crossed paths with men like Silas Soule, and long before the choices he made would stain his legacy forever. Chivington was born in Ohio in 1821, in a time when life was hard and families survived through long hours of farm work and strong faith. His own family lived simply, and religion played a powerful role in their lives. From a young age, John was drawn to the idea of preaching. He loved the sound of a strong voice rising above a crowd. He admired how a preacher could move people, make them think, feel, and act. As he grew older, he followed this path. He studied the Bible, spoke passionately about salvation, and soon became a Methodist minister. In those early years, he built his identity around words that inspired, healed, and uplifted. He believed deeply in the power of moral conviction. But conviction can take many forms, and in Chivington's life, it would slowly shift from spiritual strength to something much darker. When the Civil War began in 1861, the country fell into chaos. Families were divided. Towns were torn apart. Soldiers marched across fields, soaked in blood. Many preachers urged peace, but Chivington did not. He believed strongly in the Union cause. He believed slavery must end, and he believed that sometimes violence was necessary. So, he traded his pulpit for a uniform. He joined the Union Army and rose quickly through the ranks. His booming voice became the voice of command. His charisma made him popular with the men, and his fierce determination made him a natural leader. Soon he gained a reputation, not as a preacher, but as a fighter. His defining moment came at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in New Mexico, often called the Gettysburg of the West. Confederate forces were pushing into the territory, and the Union needed a victory badly. Chivington played a key role in the battle by leading a surprise attack on the Confederate supply train. Without food, ammunition, or equipment, the Confederate army was forced to retreat. It was a clever, bold move. Newspapers praised him. Soldiers admired him. And suddenly, John Chivington was a hero. The title, the Fighting Parson, spread everywhere. People loved the idea of a preacher who could preach righteousness on Sunday and fight bravely on Monday. His fame grew. His ego grew with it. But pride can be a dangerous companion. After the battle, Chivington was promoted, celebrated, and welcomed wherever he went. He began to see himself not just as a soldier, but as a man destined for greatness. He dreamed of political power. He pictured himself as governor of Colorado Territory, maybe even as a national figure. He wanted influence, recognition, and a story that would outshine every other hero of the West. And this ambition, this hunger began to change him. By the time he reached Colorado in 1864, the territory was filled with tension between settlers and native tribes. Fear spread faster than news. Rumors about raids, attacks, and threats circulated constantly. In this atmosphere of panic, Chivington saw an opportunity. He saw that many settlers wanted a strong leader, someone who would promise safety, someone who would strike fear into their enemies, someone who would take action swift, decisive, and brutal if necessary. And Chivington believed he could be that man. He began giving powerful speeches in Denver, using harsh words against native tribes. He claimed they were dangerous, untrustworthy, and responsible for every attack in the region. He called for force. He called for courage. He called for destruction. These speeches drew large crowds. People cheered. Some felt safer. Others felt encouraged to hate. And Chivington watched this reaction with growing satisfaction. He realized something important. Violence could win him political support. During this time, Silas Soule served under him, observing quietly. Silas saw the shift in Chivington's personality, the way ambition drove him more powerfully than faith, the way anger guided him more strongly than truth. Silas sensed a dangerous flame burning inside Chivington, a flame that would only grow hotter the more he fed it. But Silas kept his thoughts to himself. Meanwhile, Chivington gained command of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, a unit formed quickly and known more for inexperience than discipline. Most were new recruits. Many were eager for excitement. Some were motivated by revenge after family. Members had been killed in earlier conflicts. Chivington fueled their anger with fiery speeches. He assured them that fighting native tribes was not only necessary, it was righteous. He promised that victory would bring honor, glory, and safety. And he positioned himself as the man who would deliver that victory. Yet beneath all his bold words was something unspoken, something he did not admit to others, and maybe barely admitted to himself. He wanted another victory like Glorieta Pass. He wanted something big, something unforgettable, something that would launch him into political greatness. By late 1864, his ambition had grown stronger than his judgment. He began to view all native tribes as enemies, ignoring peace treaties, negotiations, and promises made by other officers. He listened to fear, not facts. He listened to applause, not conscience. And when reports began circulating about a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village camped along Sand Creek families who believed they were under government protection, Chivington did not see innocence. He saw opportunity. He saw a chance for a dramatic victory, a victory he believed the territory would celebrate, a victory that would guarantee his rise to power. But as that dark November morning approached, 2 men were riding toward the same camp with 2 very different hearts. One driven by ambition, the other guided by conscience. One ready to attack, the other ready to refuse. Their paths would collide at Sand Creek, and history would remember the choices they made in very different ways. In 1864, the Colorado Territory was a land caught between hope and fear. Beautiful wide plains stretched for miles, meeting mountains that rose high into the sky like giants guarding the west. But beneath this natural beauty, life was unstable. Every day felt like walking on ground that could break open without warning. Settlers moved into the region in growing numbers, building cabins, setting up farms, and searching for gold in the rivers and hills. They brought wagons, dreams, families, and worries. Many had traveled thousands of miles hoping for a better life. But the West was unpredictable, and in Colorado, fear lived close to the surface. That fear was not created from one single event. It grew slowly from rumors, from half-understood stories, from misunderstandings, and from the long history of conflict between native tribes and white settlers. Every small incident, every missing animal, every distant gunshot became another reason to feel unsafe. In this environment, even peaceful people could become suspicious. Even reasonable people could become angry. And ambitious men, like Colonel Chivington, could take advantage of that fear. At the center of the rising tension were the Cheyenne and Arapaho, two tribes who had lived on the plains long before the first settlers arrived. They hunted buffalo, moved with the seasons, and raised their families along rivers and streams. Most wanted peace. Most wanted to continue living as they always had, but the world around them was changing too fast. Land once open to all was now being claimed, fenced, and divided. Trails grew crowded. Military forts appeared across the territory, and small conflicts, sometimes accidents, sometimes misunderstandings, slowly grew into larger ones. By 1864, the atmosphere was tense enough that a single spark could set the entire region ablaze. Many settlers feared attacks from tribes, especially after isolated incidents of violence during previous years. Leaders repeated stories, some true, some exaggerated, some completely false, and the constant uncertainty made even calm minds restless. But not everyone gave in to fear. Among the Cheyenne and Arapaho, leaders like Black Kettle, an elderly and respected peace chief, continued to speak firmly about cooperation. Black Kettle believed that peace with the United States was not only possible, but essential. He had met with military leaders, signed documents, and followed every instruction given to him by government agents. He wanted to protect his people. He wanted to avoid war. He raised the American flag above his lodge sign, meant to show loyalty and trust. United States officials had told him that flying the flag meant he would be protected. Black Kettle believed him. He wanted to believe in a peaceful future at the same time. U.S. officers like Major Edward Wynkoop and Major Scott Anthony tried to build trust between tribes and the Army. They listened, negotiated, and hoped for stability. Silas Soule admired men like Wynkoop leaders who understood that not every conflict required a gun. But Chivington saw things differently. He saw fear as a tool, and he used it well. He gave speeches in towns across the territory, claiming that all tribes were dangerous and must be punished before they attacked again. He blamed the Cheyenne and Arapaho for violence committed by other groups. He told settlers that the only way to make Colorado safe was through force. Many people believed him. They were tired of being afraid. They were tired of rumors. They wanted someone to promise safety, even if the price was blood. And in this restless atmosphere, the government made decisions that only increased confusion. Orders were mixed. Promises were unclear. Messages from Washington took weeks or months to arrive. At times, even Army officers weren't sure what the official policy toward local tribes was supposed to be. The Cheyenne and Arapaho, trying to follow instructions, were told to move to Fort Lyon to show their peaceful intentions. Black Kettle and other leaders traveled long distances to meet with officers, hoping to prove they wanted no conflict. They were promised food, protection, and communication with higher authorities. But promises in the West were fragile. Many were broken before the ink dried. And as winter approached, a dangerous mix of confusion, fear, and ambition began to form the kind of mix that could lead to tragedy. Silas Soule watched everything unfold with increasing concern. He had seen fear twist people before. He had seen how uncertainty could turn into anger, and how anger could turn into violence. And now he saw Chivington once, a preacher feeding that same anger, pushing the territory toward a fight that did not need to happen. Silas spent time at Fort Lyon, hearing stories from Cheyenne families, meeting with leaders like Black Kettle, and seeing with his own eyes that these villages were not preparing for war. They were preparing for winter. They were gathering food, caring for children, and hoping their peace efforts would keep them safe. But rumors traveled faster than truth in Denver. Settlers whispered that warriors were gathering for attacks. Someone claimed that tribes had stolen cattle. Someone else claimed a family had gone missing. Even when stories were proven false, the fear remained. People were ready to believe the worst, and Chivington was ready to act. He had created a volunteer regiment called the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, made up of men who served only 100 days. Many were inexperienced. Some were angry about earlier raids in the territory. Some joined because they wanted revenge. Others joined because they were told they would be heroes. To these men, Chivington made a bold promise. He would lead them to a victory that would save the territory and bring them fame. He told them the enemy was gathering. He told them they had one chance to strike. He told them this was a moment of destiny. He did not tell them that the enemy he had in mind was a peaceful camp. And as November 1864 approached, the path to Sand Creek was already forming, a path built from fear, misunderstanding, broken promises, and ambition. A path that would soon collide with the conscience of Silas Soule and the ambition of John Chivington. By late November of 1864, the air across the Colorado plains carried a bitter cold, sharp enough to sting the skin, quiet enough to make every sound feel louder. Winter was approaching fast, and the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unseen. In this frozen silence, hundreds of soldiers prepared for a mission most of them barely understood. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry, led by Colonel John Chivington, had gathered east of Fort Lyon. They were tired, restless, and anxious to prove themselves. Many had never fought in a real battle. Some had joined only weeks earlier. Others were fueled by rumors and fear, believing they were marching toward a camp of warriors ready to attack settlers. But not everyone believed the stories. Captain Silas Soule rode quietly among the troops, watching the men sharpen their weapons and adjust their saddles. He kept his thoughts to himself, but inside, he felt a heavy weight growing stronger each day. Something about this mission felt wrong, too rushed, too secretive, too full of hidden anger. The soldiers did not know their target. Only Chivington and a few officers knew the truth. Silas had heard whispers, fragments of conversations, hints dropped in meetings, and from those pieces, a picture began to form. A disturbing picture. A peaceful Cheyenne in a Arapaho village. Families who had been promised protection. People who believed they were safe. Silas felt the cold bite deeper as he considered what might happen if Chivington's anger mixed with the inexperience of his volunteers. He remembered Black Kettle's words, spoken weeks earlier at Fort Lyon, words of trust, of hope, of belief in peace. "We have raised your flag," Black Kettle had said. "We will do as you ask." Silas had watched him speak with dignity, even after so many struggles. And now, as Chivington rode ahead of the regiment, Silas wondered if that trust was about to be crushed. The column moved out before midnight. The sky was black, and the moon was thin, casting only a faint glow on the frost-covered earth. Horses snorted clouds of white breath. Boots crunched against frozen ground. The only light came from lanterns swinging softly at officers' sides. Silas rode beside his company, keeping pace with them. He knew the men respected him. He also knew they were confused. They had not been told where they were going or who they were marching. Many whispered among themselves, guessing, worrying, imagining danger where there might be none. Hours passed. The night grew colder. They crossed stretches of flat land, frozen streams, and open fields. And then, just before dawn, they reached a small rise overlooking the sandy banks of a creek. Sand Creek. Chivington ordered the column to halt. His officers gathered around him, speaking in hushed tones. Silas listened carefully, catching fragments of their words as the wind carried them. "Strike now. They won't expect. No prisoners. Victory for the territory." Silas's jaw tightened. He felt something inside him twist with dread. Chivington turned to his men, his face lit by the first faint light of morning. His voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "Men," he shouted, "we ride to attack a hostile camp. Your duty is clear. Your courage will be remembered. Do your part today, and Colorado will never forget your service." His words echoed across the still land. Silas looked toward the village below. As the light grew stronger, he could make out shaped teepees, small fires, blankets, families stirring from sleep, children, women, elderly men. He saw no warriors preparing for battle, no army gathering. He saw life, ordinary, peaceful life. His heart dropped. Chivington raised his arm, prepared to charge. The soldiers tensed. Muskets were ready. Horses pawed the ground. Silas felt his throat tighten. In all his years, through all the chaos he had seen from Kansas, territory to the Civil War, he had always been able to tell the difference between battle and slaughter. And this was no battle. This was a trap. He heard one of his lieutenants whisper, "Sir, they look peaceful." But the voice was swallowed by the rising noise of soldiers. Preparing to attack, Chivington glared at anyone who hesitated. "Those are the enemy," he said with fury. "We strike at dawn." Silas's thoughts raced. He remembered his childhood, freeing enslaved men from bondage. He remembered his father's voice telling him to follow his conscience. He remembered Black Kettle's trust, Wynkoop's warnings, and the village's peaceful presence at Fort Lyon. How could he fire on people who had done everything asked of them? How could he raise his weapon against families who believed they were safe? How could he betray the truth he had carried his whole life? He felt his pulse beat harder and harder in his ears. The moment was coming. The moment that would define him. The sun touched the horizon with a thin line of red light. Morning arrived, slow and heavy. The eastern sky brightened. The village below began to wake. Unaware of the danger approaching, Chivington raised his arm high. Attack. Silas did not move. His men looked at him, immediately waiting, unsure, trusting. They would follow whatever he commanded. Their loyalty was not to Chivington. Their loyalty was to him. He knew what that meant. With one word, he could save them from becoming part of something unforgivable. With one word, he could keep their hands clean. With one word, he could defy an order that went against everything he believed. Silas's breath steadied. His voice rose above the thunder of hooves. Calm, firm, unshaken. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "My men will not fire." His words split the air like lightning. Some soldiers stared in shock. Some cursed. Some hesitated mid-trot. But Silas stayed tall in his saddle, refusing to move, refusing to join the attack, refusing to let his conscience die on the banks of Sand Creek. The dawn attack had begun, but Silas Soule had already chosen his path, a path of courage, a path of sacrifice, a path that would make him a hero, even if it cost him everything. The first shots of the Sand Creek attack cracked through the cold morning air like lightning. Soldiers screamed as they charged downhill. Horses stumbled forward, hooves throwing up sand and frost. Smoke exploded from rifles, drifting across the plains like a dark cloud stretching toward the sky. But in the middle of this rising storm, one company stood still, utterly still. Captain Silas Soule sat firm on his horse, jaw clenched, heart pounding, eyes locked on the peaceful village below. The world around him was exploding into violence, but inside him, a deeper battle was taking place. A battle between fear and duty, between survival and conscience. He had made his choice, and now he had to stand by it. "Captain, orders," one of his lieutenants shouted, trembling, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Silas lifted his chin. "Hold your fire," he said, clear and steady. "No one fires. No one moves." His men stared at him, stunned. They had expected hesitation, maybe even protest, but not this. Not a direct refusal, not a line drawn so sharply in the sand. Silas knew what they were thinking. He knew the danger he was placing himself in. Refusing an order in wartime was no small thing. It could destroy a career. It could bring military punishment. It could bring death. But he could not lift his weapon. Not today. Not for this. The soldiers around him watched the attack begin. They saw hundreds of Chivington's volunteers charging toward the village, firing wildly, shouting, pushing forward with fury. They saw families running, confused and terrified. They saw children clinging to their mothers, elders stumbling toward the creek, warriors trying desperately to defend their people. One of Soule's younger men whispered, "Captain, there are children." Silas swallowed hard. His face tightened, but his voice did not waver. "That is why we do not fire," he answered quietly. Behind him, another officer rode close, his face red with anger. "What are you doing, Soule?" he shouted. "Why aren't your men moving?" Silas turned to face him. His eyes were calm, steady, unwavering. "This is not a battle," he said. "This is murder, and my company will not take part." The officer cursed and rode off, disappearing into the smoke and chaos. Silas knew this refusal would reach Chivington soon. He also knew Chivington would not forget it. Men like Chivington did not tolerate defiance, but Silas did not bend. While screams echoed from the village, he kept his men steady, forming a barrier that prevented them from joining the slaughter. Some of his soldiers looked pale. Others looked sick. A few looked relieved. They trusted their captain. They trusted his judgment. And they knew deep down that firing into a camp of families would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Silas took a deep breath and watched the scene unfold. He saw Black Kettle raise the American flag, waving it desperately, hoping it would remind the soldiers of their promise of protection. Silas felt his heart wrench as he watched bullets fly past the flag. Ripping through the air without mercy, he heard a woman scream for help. He saw a young boy fall. He saw warriors trying to lead their people to safety, even as they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. The smoke grew thicker. The air grew colder. The cries grew louder. Silas turned to one of his sergeants. "Spread our men out. Form a perimeter. No one chases fleeing families. No one leaves the line." The sergeant nodded, relieved to have direction of purpose that didn't involve killing. Some families ran toward Soule's stationary company, desperate for any chance of escape. Silas quickly gestured for them to move behind his line, away from the direction of gunfire. He couldn't save everyone, but he could save some. And so, quietly, without drawing attention, Silas and his men became a shield. A small shield, but a shield nonetheless. At one point, a mounted soldier from Chivington's force rode up to Soule, fury burning across his face. "Are you deserting the fight?" The soldier shouted. Silas met his eyes, calm and cold. "I am following my duty," he said. "My duty to what's right." The soldier cursed and galloped off. Silas watched him disappear, then exhaled slowly. Every defiant word was a nail in his coffin, but he could not stay silent. Not today. Hours passed as the attack dragged on. It was supposed to be quick, but the chaos spread far beyond what Chivington expected. Silas could only witness the horror unfolding at a distance. He couldn't intervene, not openly, but he held firm, denying Chivington the support of his entire company. When the gunfire finally faded and the smoke drifted away, the land around Sand Creek was silent to silent. It was the kind of silence that follows tragedy, a silence that sinks into the earth itself. Silas sat on his horse, staring at the devastation below. He felt sick. He felt angry. He felt ashamed of what his uniform now represented on that field. But he also felt something else, a grim strengthening of his resolve. He had done the right thing, and doing the right thing was rarely easy. As his men regrouped, one of them approached him quietly. "Captain, you saved lives today." Silas didn't smile. He didn't nod. He only looked toward the horizon, where the smoke still drifted. "This isn't over," he said, voice low. "There will be truth to tell, and the truth will cost us." He knew Chivington would not forgive him. He knew powerful men would want silence. He knew the truth could get him killed. But he also knew something more important. A man's honor is worth more than his safety, and his conscience was worth more than Chivington's anger. Silas Soule had stood against bloodshed. Now he would have to stand against the consequences. The Battle of Sand Creek was ending, but Silas's real battle was just beginning. When the gunfire at Sand Creek finally faded, the world seemed to stop breathing. The smoke drifted slowly into the sky, forming a dark cloud that hung over the plains like a shadow of guilt. The sounds of the attacks, screaming, shouting, gunshots echoed in the cold air long after the last rifle fell silent. Captain Silas Soule sat on his horse, staring across the land, his face pale and still. What he saw was not war. It was devastation. The peaceful village that once stood along the sandy banks was now shattered. Teepees lay torn apart. Fires smoldered quietly. Figures moved slowly, searching for loved ones, for survivors, for anything that remained untouched. The air smelled of gunpowder, smoke, and heartbreak. Silas felt a deep ache in his chest. He had refused to take part. He had saved the men under his command from participating, but he could not escape the weight of what had been done. As Chivington's soldiers moved through the wreckage, some cheering, some silent, some shaken by what they had witnessed, Silas remained apart. His company stayed in formation, watching uneasy, unsure of what to do next. One of Silas's men whispered, "Captain, what happens now?" Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the remnants of the camp. "This is not the end," he finally said. "This will follow us." Chivington rode through the chaotic scene with a hard expression, part triumph, part pride, and part something else Silas could not quite understand. Satisfaction, maybe, or the cold glow of a man who believed the world had just proven him right. When he saw Silas, he scowled. "Captain Colonel Chivington said sharply, I've been told you refused my order." Silas met his commander's stare. He felt fear, yes, but he also felt a stronger force rising in him. "I did," Silas answered. Chivington's eyes narrowed. "You disobeyed a direct command." I refuse to fire on a peaceful camp." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, one burning with pride and ambition, the other steady with conscience. The cold wind blew between them like a warning. Chivington leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You will keep quiet about today," he growled. "Do you understand? This is a victory for Colorado. Nothing else." But Silas did not reply. His silence was answer enough. As evening fell, the soldiers began returning to Fort Lyon. Some laughed and bragged about the attack. Others avoided meeting anyone's eyes, haunted by what they had seen. A few walked in silence, confused and shaken, unable to understand how victory could feel so hollow. Silas rode behind them, the weight on his shoulders growing heavier with every mile. He knew he could keep quiet and save himself trouble. He knew speaking out might destroy his career, his reputation, even his life. But he also knew something else. Truth mattered more than comfort. And if he stayed silent, the innocent dead at Sand Creek would have no voice at all. When the soldiers reached the fort, the mood shifted. Officers celebrated the victory, preparing messages to send to Denver and Washington. Chivington demanded reports filled with praise, honor, and heroism. Silas sat alone in his quarters, trembling with anger. He could not sleep. He could not rest. He reached for paper and ink, and that night, by the light of a small lantern, Captain Silas Soule wrote. His letters were not dramatic or exaggerated. They were simple, clear, and painfully honest. He described what he had seen, what he had refused to do, and what Chivington had led the soldiers into. He wrote about the flag Black Kettle raised. He wrote about the families running for their lives. He wrote about the bodies on the cold ground. His words were steady, but his hand shook. He knew these letters could cost him everything, but he wrote anyway. These letters soon reached trusted friends, fellow officers who valued honor. One of them was Major Edward Wynkoop, who had long advocated for peace. Wynkoop understood immediately what Silas's letters meant. They were evidence powerful, heartbreaking evidence of a massacre. Word slowly spread. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into outrage. Reports reached Washington, where government officials began demanding explanations. How could a peaceful camp have been attacked? How could families be slaughtered under the American flag? Who had ordered this? And the name that kept appearing in letters, testimonies, and reports was the same. Colonel John M.C. Chivington. As investigations began, Chivington became defensive and furious. He claimed Sand Creek was a battle. He insisted the villagers were hostile. He accused anyone who disagreed with him of being a liar or a traitor. But Silas Soule would not be silenced. When Congress called for witnesses, Silas stepped forward. He stood tall, wearing his uniform, and told the truth clearly, without anger, without fear, without hesitation. He described what he saw. He described what he refused to do. He described Chivington's orders. His testimony was calm, strong, and devastating. Some officers tried to pressure him into changing his story. Others warned him that speaking out would make him enemies. But Silas knew something deeply important. A man without truth is a man without honor. A soldier without integrity is no soldier at all. When he finished testifying, the room was silent. Even those who had doubted him could not deny his courage or the clarity of his words. But outside the courtroom, danger stirred. Men loyal to Chivington whispered in dark corners. They grumbled about Soule's betrayal. They watched him closely. They followed him through Denver streets late at night. Silas knew he had painted a target on his back. He knew some people wanted revenge, but he did not regret anything. He had refused to fire. He had spoken the truth, and now he was ready to face whatever consequences followed. Sand Creek was behind him, but the shadows it cast were growing darker, and soon those shadows would reach for him. By early 1865, Silas Soule had become more than an officer. He had become a symbol of truth in a place where lies were loud, a symbol of courage in a time when fear ruled hearts, a symbol of conscience in a world slipping into cruelty. But symbols draw enemies, and Silas Soule knew it. After his testimony against Colonel Chivington, Denver buzzed with tension. People whispered in saloons, in streets, and in dim corners of military camps. Some called Silas a hero. Others called him a traitor who had embarrassed the territory, shamed the cavalry, and ruined the reputation of a powerful man. Silas heard every whisper, every warning, but he did not hide. He kept wearing his uniform with quiet pride. He kept walking through the streets with his usual calm steps. He kept speaking openly about Sand Creek whenever asked. He believed truth was worth protecting. He did not realize how much it might cost. As spring approached, Silas married a young woman named Hersa Coberly. She had a warm smile and gentle eyes, and she believed Silas was one of the few truly honorable men in the West. Their wedding was small, simple, and beautiful. Friends said Silas looked the happiest he had ever been. For a brief moment, his life felt peaceful. He had love. He had honor. He had a future. But peace is fragile, especially when enemies walk in the shadows. The threats begin days after the wedding. Silas began receiving warnings. A friend pulled him aside. "Be careful. Men are watching you." Another whispered late at night, "You spoke too much." "Silas, they won't let it go." He knew who they were, loyalists of Colonel Chivington. Some were angry soldiers who believed Soule had betrayed his commander. Others were violent men who thought the massacre was justified. Some simply hated that a man like Soule dared to expose the truth. Silas ignored the threats. He had never been one to run from danger. But he did write to a close friend, "I feel that something will happen to me soon, but I am ready. I have done what was right." These words would later break the hearts of everyone who read them. A quiet night turns deadly in April 23, 1865. Denver was quiet. The sun had set behind the mountains, and a soft darkness covered the streets. Lanterns flickered in windows. The town seemed calm, almost peaceful. Silas had just finished dinner with his wife. They shared laughter, small stories, simple happiness, the kind that makes life feel safe. He kissed her forehead and stepped outside for a short walk. The air was cool. The streets were nearly empty. His boots echoed softly as he walked along the boardwalk. But he was not alone. Two men watched him from the shadows, men who had been following him for days, men hired or encouraged by those who wanted him silenced. Silas did not see them at first. He only heard footsteps behind him, too quick, too close. He turned and the gun flashed. A deafening shot ripped through the quiet night. The bullet struck Silas in the head. He staggered back, collapsing against the dirt road. His hat fell beside him. Blood spread slowly beneath him, dark against the ground. His breathing was shallow, fading. His eyes blinked once, twice, then grew dim. Hersa heard the gunshot and rushed outside. She screamed when she saw him lying there. Neighbors ran toward them, lanterns shaking in their hands, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. "Silas," she cried, falling to her knees. But Silas Soule was already gone. The man who had refused to kill had been killed for refusing. The escaped witnesses saw two men running down the street. One jumped on a waiting horse. The other sprinted through the alleys, disappearing into the night. Denver's officers reacted quickly. They captured one suspected man named Charles Squire, a former soldier. The other, a man named Jules Jake LaFleur, escaped into Indian territory and was never found. Squire was arrested. Many believed he would reveal who ordered the assassination. But before the trial could begin, Squire mysteriously escaped custody. Some said guards helped him. Some said powerful men paid for his freedom. Some said Chivington's loyalists made sure the truth never came out. What mattered most was this: no one was ever punished for killing Silas Soule. The aftermath of news of Soule's murder spread like wildfire. Across the territory, people mourned. Soldiers who respected him wept openly. Friends were devastated. His wife, married barely a few weeks, was shattered. Major Wynkoop wrote in sorrow, "We have lost a man of the purest heart and greatest courage." Silas was buried with honor, but his grave became more than a resting place. It became a symbol of the cost of truth, a symbol of conscience in a violent world, a symbol of a man who stood against cruelty, even when it meant standing alone. Meanwhile, Chivington's reputation collapsed. The investigations condemned him, the testimonies exposed him, and the man who once dreamed of political power lived the rest of his life under the shadow of disgrace. But Silas's story did not die. His letters survived. His testimony survived. His courage survived. History would remember him not as a traitor, not as a troublemaker, but as one of the true heroes of the American West. Silas Soule died young, but he died with honor, and honor endures longer than fear, longer than ambition, longer than any bullet in the dark dot. In the months after Silas Soule's murder, the Colorado Territory felt strangely quiet, too quiet. It was the silence that comes after a storm, when people walk carefully, speaking in whispers, afraid that the leftover winds might still return. But something had changed forever. Two legacies were forming side by side. One belonged to Silas Soule, a young captain who gave his life for truth. The other belonged to John Milton Chivington, a colonel, whose ambition drowned in the blood of Sand Creek. Their paths had crossed for only a short time, but their fates could not have been more different. After his death, Silas Soule became more than a man. His story spread across the West like a spark catching dry grass. Letters he wrote describing Sand Creek began circulating in newspapers. Officers repeated the bravery he showed on the battlefield, not the bravery of violence, but the bravery of restraint. People spoke his name with respect. They said he was the only man who refused. He protected his men. He told the truth. Even when truth was dangerous, Silas had never wanted fame. He had never wanted glory. He only wanted to do what was right. But now, his quiet courage began shaping how people understood the massacre. Without his letters, without his testimony, the truth of Sand Creek might have been buried under lies. Instead, his words became a light that exposed everything. Congress held multiple investigations. Officers testified. Witnesses described what they saw. And every detail Silas had written, every observation, every horror was confirmed again and again. One investigator wrote, "Had Captain Soule remained silent, the world might never have known the truth." To the Cheyenne and Arapaho survivors, Soule became a symbol of rare honor among U.S. soldiers. They spoke of him with gratitude, calling him the man who stood against wrong. Even in death, Silas served justice. While Silas's name rose, Chivington's collapsed. At first, he tried to defend himself. He gave speeches claiming Sand Creek was a great victory. He called the peaceful villagers hostile warriors. He insisted he had saved the territory. But the truth kept pushing back, and the truth was stronger. Investigators confronted Chivington with evidence letters, testimonies, eyewitness reports. They questioned him again and again, and the more he tried to defend himself, the more obvious his guilt became. Newspapers began calling Sand Creek what it truly was: a massacre, a slaughter, a crime against innocents. Even officers who once admired Chivington now turned away from him. His reputation, once bright with military success, was stained beyond repair. He tried to run for political office, dreaming of power, but voters rejected him. No one wanted a leader whose name was tied to the murder of families. His face once appeared in heroic sketches. Now it appeared in newspapers as a symbol of disgrace. People whispered about him in saloons, the same way they whispered about Soule, but with disgust, not admiration. He betrayed his honor. He lied to the people. He let ambition destroy him. Chivington spent the rest of his life moving from place to place, carrying the weight of his own decisions. He opened businesses that failed. He tried to reinvent himself. But the past followed him everywhere, like a shadow he could never outrun. He died with no glory, no power, no triumph. Only shame. In history, men are often remembered for what they choose to defend. Silas defended life. Chivington defended pride. Silas defended truth. Chivington defended lies. Silas defended honor. Chivington defended ambition. Their stories became bound to one another, not as allies, not as enemies, but as opposites. One showed what courage looks like when pointed toward justice. The other showed what ambition becomes when fed by fear. In Denver, people gathered at Silas Soule's funeral with bowed heads and heavy hearts. His wife wept quietly, holding the handkerchief he gave her on their wedding day. Friends spoke of his laughter, his kindness, and his bravery. Soldiers in uniform saluted him with trembling hands. But at Chivington's funeral, years later, the crowd was small. His name barely appeared in newspapers. The world had moved on, leaving him behind. Two men entered history from the same doorway: war, fear, the frontier. But they walked out through different exits. As the decades passed, the memory of Sand Creek did not fade. Survivors told their children and grandchildren what happened. Elders repeated the story around campfires. Historians wrote books, articles, and reports. And every time the story was told, Silas Soule stood at the center not as a perfect man, not as a flawless hero, but as a human being who made the hardest choice a person can make. He chose conscience over command. Visitors began leaving small stones at his grave. Students wrote essays about him. Artists painted his portrait with soft, respectful colors. His name appeared in history books as a man who stood for what was right when many others did not. And Chivington, he became a warning, a symbol of what happens when ambition blinds a man to humanity. Some remembered his military skill, but most remembered his cruelty. His name was not spoken with admiration. It was spoken with caution. As history looked back, it became clear. Silas Soule's greatness did not come from battle. It came from refusal. His power did not come from violence. It came from mercy. His courage did not come from following orders. It came from standing alone. And though he died young, his legacy lives far longer than those who tried to silence him, because in the story of Sand Creek, only one man stands tall: Silas Soule, the hero who said no. In the decades after Sand Creek, the story of Silas Soule echoed across the American West like a quiet but unbreakable song. It was not carried by trumpets or flags or military parades. It was carried by whispers, by truth-tellers, by survivors, and by anyone who believed that moral courage mattered more than fear. Silas had lived only 26 years. He had walked the earth for a short time, but his life became a message that generations would carry, even as towns grew. Railroads stretched across the plains, and the frontier changed. People continued to speak his name. Some told his story to their children as a lesson in bravery. Others remembered him when they passed through Denver, stopping at his grave, leaving flowers, stones, or small notes thanking him for what he did. Across the plains, the descendants of the Cheyenne and Arapaho remembered him with honor. They remembered the officer who refused to fire, the man who protected the innocent, the soldier who stood alone against cruelty. Their stories kept his memory alive not as a legend, but as a real man who made a real choice that saved real lives for a long time. The United States tried to heal from the wounds of the Civil War, but the wound of Sand Creek remained open. It lived in the memories of survivors, in the stories told around fires, and in the painful silence that followed whenever someone asked what happened that day. Many people tried to rewrite the story. Some tried to defend Chivington. Some tried to soften the truth. Some tried to bury the past. But the truth had already found a voice, and that voice was Silas Soule. His letters, written with trembling hands, but with a fearless heart, had exposed everything. His testimony before Congress had carved the truth into history, and his sacrifice made sure the truth could never be erased. Because of him, the nation faced what happened at Sand Creek. Because of him, the massacre was recognized for what it truly was. Because of him, the memories of those who died were protected. Meanwhile, Chivington's name fell deeper into darkness. He lived for years after the massacre, but he did not live in pride. He moved from job to job, place to place, carrying the weight of the truth he had tried to hide. Some said he still believed he was right. Some said he refused to admit anything. Some said he grew angry whenever someone spoke Silas's name. But history did not side with him. Years passed. Monuments went up to honor victims. Teachers told students about Sand Creek as a tragedy, not a triumph. And historians wrote Chivington's name with sadness, disappointment, and shame. His ambition had once burned bright, but ambition without conscience burns everything it touches, and in the end, only ashes remained. Silas Soule's act at Sand Creek may have lasted only seconds, a simple refusal, a moment of courage, a decision made in the middle of chaos. But those few seconds changed history. They showed that one man's conscience can stand against hundreds of guns. They showed that soldiers are not machines. They are human beings with the power to choose right from wrong. They showed that honor is not about victory, but integrity. Silas did not know how history would remember him. He did not know the cost he would pay. He only knew he could not betray his beliefs, and that choice, brave and powerful, became his legacy. Today, Silas Soule is remembered as a hero of the American West, not the kind who draws a gun faster than anyone, not the kind who wins battles, but the kind who wins something much harder, the battle for his own soul. In a world filled with violence, he showed mercy. In a world filled with fear, he showed courage. In a world filled with ambition, he showed conscience. He stood against a powerful commander. He stood against his own army. He stood against the tide of history that demanded silence, and he paid for it with his life. But heroes do not always live long. Heroes live true. Silas lived true. As history looks back on the events at Sand Creek, one lesson rises above all others. Lesson written not in books, but in the choices of one young soldier. Courage is not always charging forward. Sometimes, courage is standing still. Sometimes, courage is saying no. Silas Soule's voice was steady when he said those words, strong when he testified, clear when he defended the innocent. And though the bullet that killed him tried to silence that voice, it failed. Because his voice lives on every time someone tells his story, every time someone stands against injustice, every time someone chooses conscience over command. Silas Soule died on a dark night in Denver, but his legacy lights every corner of history that values truth. He was the hero of Sand Creek, not because he fought, but because he refused. And so, the story ends where all great stories end, not with the fall of a villain, but with the rise of a hero whose courage outlives him. Silas Soule's life reminds every listener, every viewer, every soul who hears his name. You always have a choice, even when others demand obedience, even when fear surrounds you, even when the cost is high. Choose what is right, stand firm, and let your courage echo through time, just as Silas Soule's still does today.